Now, anti-capitalist protesters whose Occupy camp was cleared from outside St Pauls Cathedral overnight have warned they'll be back. Occupy London says the 4.5-month protest was only the beginning. City of London police said that 23 arrests were made during the eviction, which passed off peacefully. In a moment, we'll be talking to one of the protest leaders and the man who led the unsuccessful student protests over tuition fees. But first, this from Porrick O'Brien. This from Porrick O'Brien, whose report does contain some flash photography.
As with so many set-piece anti-capitalist evictions, there was something of the pantomime about last night. Against the most impressive of backdrops, everyone had a role.
Shame on you!
At about midnight, enter stage left, the riot police and bailiffs.
Right, stand up for a seat.
Centre stage, a makeshift barricade like badly assembled IKEA furniture with a handful of die-hard activists atop. Enter stage right, the journalists. What do you think you've achieved by all this?
Well, I hope that we're making the government and that realise that they've got to stop being greedy with our money and that it's ours and not theirs, and they've got to stop lying to us and playing games.
You don't need to preach me.
Then cue the small, dramatic-looking spectacles for an audience watching at home. There were 20+ arrests, but it all passed off relatively peacefully. This was one of the litigants in the original eviction court case.
We're exercising our right to protest.
This was another. In the crowd outside the police cordon, Giles Fraser, the ex-canon of St Paul's, who resigned over the prospect of eviction. Do you think you made the right decision standing down?
Yes, I did.
Even if it all passes off relatively peacefully tonight?
The risk is obviously high, and it's still high tonight.
But if it passes off peacefully, will you have still made the right decision, do you think?
I still hope it. Who can tell with hindsight? Hindsight's, you know. But I would have done the same thing again.
They looked like clergymen looking on from on high, underlying one certainty. The camp and Giles Fraser forced the cathedral to ask difficult questions of itself. The Occupy movement began last September with Wall Street protesters using the slogan, "We are the 99%. By October, there were organised demonstrations in cities across the US and Canada. Then they spread to South America, to Africa, to Australia, and to Tokyo and the Far East, and the major cities of Europe, including last month, the World Economic Forum in Davos. Like St Paul's, many have now been scaled back by legal action. But activists claim that it's reframed debate in this country over the government's work placement scheme, for example.
Well, I don't think you would have got to the point last week where workfare became a dirty word in this country if it wasn't for the fact that, we'd been here and we'd changed the boundaries of acceptable debate.
Today, city workers back lunching on the steps, and there's no tents in any of the school children's pictures. But did Occupy speak for any of them? In what regards were they speaking for you?
The fact that we need to make sure that when we're managing our banks, managing our finances, that we're thinking about everybody, not just only the well-off.
I had some sympathy initially, but after I spoke to a lot of the people at the university tent, I'm afraid my sympathy disappeared.
And what of the political classes? Did Occupy resonate with them? Not this one.
The Occupy movement never really nailed down precisely and defined precisely what it was, what they were protesting against or indeed arguing for.
So how would you describe what happened here last night?
I think it's the end of a rather interesting spectacle, but a rather politically irrelevant one.
Activists told us they're planning other Occupy camps. Some here will continue to be intoxicated by the cause. Some will stay intoxicated with the idea of a protest camp. And some will just remain intoxicated.
Porrick O'Brien reporting so the tents might be gone from St Paul's Cathedral, but what impact did the protesters really have? And what lessons might they teach other protest movements? To discuss this, we're joined now by Spiro van Liemenen, one of the organisers of the Occupy London protest, and also by Aaron Porter, who was president of the National Union of Students when the coalition government decided to increase tuition fees to £9,000 a year. Spiro, you clearly managed to decapitate the administration of St Paul's Cathedral, and that clearly was one notch on the bedpost. But did you do more than that, really?
Well, to start with, that was never our intention. And also just to comment on the footage we saw earlier, by being there, my impression was that it was way more peaceful than what was portrayed. And that also, it was a very emotional moment. And some people decided to resist peacefully, and some others decided to move even before the eviction.
But did you actually achieve anything?
Absolutely.
Did you achieve it? What did you achieve?
First of all, we got people talking about economic injustice that was created mainly because of the financial crisis, executive pay, corporate greed, financial banking reform. So all those issues that we have brought into the political debate are really important. And we have seen even the Financial Times talking about capitalism in crisis, or the Prime Minister talking about a more ethical economic system.
Okay,
or even,
well, let's turn to a more conventional protester. I mean, Aaron Porter, you led the NUS reaction to the raising of student fees, but you did it in an essentially conventional way and failed, one could argue.
Well, I think it's really important that the most successful campaigns are ones that don't just rely on direct action, but actually have a series of different strands. And I think it's right to say that the Occupy camp has helped to elevate the status of the debate around capitalism and whether there needs to be a new settlement.
But why? There were fewer of them than of you.
I mean, we were successful insofar as we won concessions around the edges, and we did manage to raise the issue of tuition fees.
But he's saying he managed to get executive pay talked about, bank bonuses, the wealth gap and the rest of it. That's quite a cascade of claims.
Yeah, and I guess the evidence will really be, have things really changed? I think that Occupy has been successful in terms of getting those issues to the top of the agenda, but I'm not convinced that many of the direct action protests that we've seen over the last few years have actually resulted in concrete changes from government. And I think that any campaign that relies just solely on direct action ultimately will be doomed to failure. I think that's what we saw ultimately with the tuition fee protest.
Right. It is unrealistic to believe that within 4 months we've been at St Pauls, we can bring the social change that we want. This was the first step of the Occupy movement, and we have seen, not just in the UK but around the world, in 2011 we have seen violent protests, we have seen riots, and so there is a lot of frustration in the public because of the injustices that were created since 2008. So what the Occupy movement has done is we have created a democratic space, inclusive and healthy democratic space for those ideas to be discussed.
Okay, well now there's quite a big space now outside St Paul's Cathedral where once you camped. What is going to fill this intellectual space? I mean, how do you take the movement on now that you've left the steps of St Paul's?
Well, the camp was was just the means of getting our messages across.
You set up another camp?
Well, I mean, that's possible. The decisions are taken by... But we might become even more creative at exploring different ways of direct action.
In some respects, I actually think that the camp moving on may well actually be one of the best things that helps the Occupy campaign, because I think that there was a lot of people that were naturally sympathetic towards the Occupy movement around executive pay, around bonuses and so on. They actually thought that just sitting in a camp wasn't the best way to maintain the argument going forward. And I will maintain the argument that the best way to take a campaign forward is to adopt different tactics, but also one that doesn't just use direct action, but engages in the political system as well. Do
you think that perhaps Aaron lost precisely because they didn't deploy direct action on the scale that you did?
I think that both ways of protesting, and even new ways of protesting, are very important and healthy to coexist. Personally, I lost my faith in a traditional way of protesting in 2003 when I marched with 2 million people in London against the war in Iraq, a war that was the international community was against, the public opinion was against, and nothing changed. So
I think one of the dangers we've got, though, is that actually I had Liberal Democrat MPs that had signed a pledge in part of the conventional political process, but were actually using the scenes of violence that we saw on the student protest as a reason to vote with the government rather than vote against them. And I'm not sure that simply having a campaign which is just depicted as some of the scenes that we see through kind of camps as the most effective way to make our point. We need to use a range of tactics and ensure that we keep changing over time.
Aaron Porter, Spiro van Liemenen, thank you both very much indeed.